Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Kent Boyd. I'm a doctor of nursing practice, a registered nurse, and a public health nurse. I work for the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, where I am the climate adaptation, resilience, and public health educator. So I work with communities, local governments, community-based organizations to both prepare for and adapt to the changes that we've already seen in our climate in the state, as well as the changes that we're expected to see or projected to see into the future. And I will be speaking with you all about the intersections of climate change and health, specifically looking at public health. Before we jump into the content, I wanted to just share a bit of my background um, because I find that from my own experiences as well as those that I've conversed with recently, that there aren't necessarily a lot of pathways for health professionals to get involved in climate change and planetary health. They're starting to emerge, there's a growing interest, but it's not necessarily clear. And so oftentimes they are separate from our health professional careers and practice. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I wanted to share this as kind of an example. Um, I've always loved being in nature, felt a sense of belonging in nature, and also this humbling insignificance that I was part of something much larger than myself. The beings surrounding me have come before me, that they'll outlive me, that I was a small grain of sand among the beach. Um, I also found that my actions, whether positive or negative, had large impact. And so I took that upon myself to become a good steward of the environment. But that was a personal choice, something that I did in my personal time. And I didn't necessarily see how that would overlap with my career trajectory and goals of being a health professional. So I thought they would be just kind of parallel universes. I went to the University of Minnesota. I earned my master's in nursing, and then I started practicing as a pediatric hematology, oncology, and solid organ transplant nurse at the bedside. I formed a lot of great long-term relationships with my patients. I was a part of an organization and field that got to do a lot of innovative treatments. Um, and so that was really exciting, but I quickly learned that uh, we were promoting that we were giving kiddos a second opportunity at life. Our end goal was for them to be kids and nothing more, for them to go thrive. And we were sending them out into environments that they were now at risk and vulnerable to, whether that was because of suppressants or because of comorbidities that were inevitable because of the treatments that they received, or just the mere fact that they're kids. And kids are among the most susceptible to the environmental impacts, um, such as climate change. And so I learned that my role, or where I felt the most impact, was beyond the bedside, and that was more of a systems level thinking and systems change, because these were level issues. And some of the ways in which these are system level issues is because our healthcare system in general isn't great. We spend a lot of money, to get worse outcomes than our peer countries. In fact, we spend about double that of our peer countries for those worst health outcomes. Our life expectancy is less than our peer countries. We tend are most likely to have multiple chronic conditions. We also see that the healthcare sector, if it were a country, would be the fifth largest greenhouse gas emitter. So not only do we not have a great healthcare system or health practices, we also contribute to the problem, the environment in which these populations are at risk or are vulnerable to. We contribute a large percentage to that. So those were some of the ways that I recognized um, that we were contributors to the problem, and that I could only do so much at the bedside and needed to tackle this from a systems level um, view. We see or we know that humans are causing the climate change that we're seeing. Over the last 800,000 years, if not longer, we've seen fluctuations in climate change in concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. But since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen this exponential increase in that. And we know that the human emission of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions is contributing to that problem. So this is a human-caused problem. We also see that climate change impacts health across a variety of different factors and variables. So, whether this is extreme heat or flooding, food system impacts, wildfire and smoke, etc. Um, the one thing that I like about this, not one thing, but what I like most about this diagram is that it includes mental health impacts. And I don't know where you are within your health professional training, but you may have come across mental health seems to come in last. It seems to be an afterthought in everything. And so I like this diagram because it includes mental health impacts and includes it in a cyclical pattern or not a pattern, but in a circle in that any one of these hazards also impacts mental health, and we need to be cognizant of that as professionals. The American Public Health Association takes that diagram a step further and starts to diagram the pathways in which four hazards, so rising temperature, extreme weather, air quality, and vector-borne diseases, impact different systems and environments that then ultimately impact human health. So it starts to provide this more holistic view of how these climate-related hazards impact human health and the pathways in so. The World Health Organization shared this diagram, which takes one hazard even further, but I like it because it's a good mindset of that holistic thinking, especially as we think about this being a public health issue. We need to think about the whole system and the interactions of that. So they look at extreme heat and they differentiate between direct impacts and indirect impacts. So if we're looking at the direct impacts, we're worried about things like heat illness, acceleration of death from comorbidities and exacerbation of comorbidities, and then hospitalizations. On the other side, we see the indirect impacts of an extreme heat event, which can be things like increased ambulance callouts, overburdened emergency departments, the storage of medication and the efficacy of medication, increased risks of accidents, so whether that's trying to cool down and drowning, work-related accidents or injuries, increased transmission of infectious diseases, and then potential disruption of our infrastructure, like be power, water, transportation, or worker productivity. So we need to have that holistic view of what's going on, not only with the populations that we care for, but them within their environments and the other potential causes or problems, issues that they may face. We're going to dive into some of the impacts of climate change on health. There are many more, but we're going to kind of stick to those um, common hazards that we focus on when we're talking about climate change. We're going to start with emerging infectious diseases. In Minnesota, we're all too familiar with our ticks and mosquitoes. What we're already seeing is an expansion of habitat for both the tick and mosquito, particularly northwestward for our tick population, the black-legged tick, which is the carrier of Lyme disease, into Canada towards the Rockies and expected or projected to reach Alaska by 2050. Some of what we see, other than our habitat expansion, is also the increased life cycle and breeding cycles for these vectors. Because of the warmer temperatures, the longer shoulder seasons, the decrease in or warmer winter temperatures and decrease in snow cover, all play a role in increasing the life cycle and feeding cycle of our vectors. In the next slide, we'll also see that we have expanding potential habitats for for vector-borne diseases that we necessarily shouldn't be familiar with in Minnesota. So, like subtropical vector-borne diseases, that Minnesota becomes a suitable habitat by the end of the century. So, we'll look at that a little bit as well. There is a potential for increased human-animal interaction. This is both as humans develop into areas that are mostly natural, as we expand and develop that way, but also with changing migratory patterns and increases in habitat. There's potential for more human-animal interactions. Heat and nitrogen runoff contribute to harmful algal blooms. They also mess with some of our fungal and aquatic ecosystems, and so can change the presence of disease in those areas, in those ecosystems. These maps here are ecological niche models of the AE albopictus and AE aegypti under two concentration pathways. So we have the 4.5, which is our intermediate emissions pathway, and our RCP 8.5, which is our very high emissions pathway. And then looking over different time scales, so 2010, 2020, 2015, 2080. And what you'll note is that Minnesota, the southern half of Minnesota, becomes a suitable habitat for this mosquito by 2080, by the end of the century. This is important because this mosquito is the mosquito that transmits or carries Zika, dengue, chikungunya, and yellow fever. So an otherwise subtropical disease in mosquito will have a suitable habitat in southern Minnesota by the end of the century. We talked a bit about extreme heat and heat exposure, but I wanted to also go into depth about the medication interactions, at least slightly. Um, Medication interactions and heat can either be uh, uh, a, in, cause a decrease in efficacy. Excuse me. So they either cause a decrease in efficacy, they can impact the way that our body responds and thermoregulates, and then it can also have a, a it can also lead to a difficulty in the perception of heat, so our cognitive ability to comprehend heat. So when we look at SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or our other depression and mental health medications, those tend to impact the way that we perceive heat. Um, we don't necessarily have that cognitive recognition that we are hot and then therefore can't take the preventative measures to protect ourselves. Cardiovascular medications, thyroid medications, other endocrine medications, um, can impact our body's ability to thermoregulate, and so we don't have that natural ability to respond to heat in the way that we normally would, and that can lead to an exacerbation of comorbidities and also an exacerbation of heat illness, almost a surprise attack of heat illness. And then last is the efficacy. Two examples here are diabetes medications of insulin require refrigeration. And so if we have a power outage or if they're in a place where they're not being refrigerated for whatever reason, they will lose their efficacy in a heat event. And then asthma inhalers they lose their efficacy at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we're increasing the days where we have temperatures like that, and say we store our inhaler in our vehicles where it's also warmer than what the air temperature is, there's a greater possibility of damaging and decreasing the efficacy of our medications. So that's something to be aware of when it relates to medication interactions and heat exposure. The other thing with heat that I want to mention is that there's an increased risk of violence. We see an uptick in violent episodes during heat events. When we look at smoke and air pollution, we're particularly concerned about respiratory and cardiovascular disease, exacerbation, and manifestation. We know, or we're starting to see more and more studies that show even brief exposure to smoke and air pollution can cause respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. A lot of air pollutants are carcinogenic, and air pollutants cause an inflammatory response in our bodies. And the smaller the particle, the deeper into our lungs the particle can travel, or the pollutant can travel, and it can even pass into our bloodstream where no part of our body is off limits to the impacts of that pollutant. When we look at flooding, we're concerned about introduction of waterborne diseases, also injury from a flooding event, post-flood cleanup and mold exposure, and then also uh, the destruction of property during a flooding event. Particularly in Minnesota, but other areas that have humidity, it's important to remember too that it's not just air temperature when we're talking about heat events. If we only look at air temperature, we're missing part of the picture. So for example, in Minnesota, if it were a 90-degree day, but say we had our somewhat typical 50% to 60% humidity, or even 65%, that 90-degree day feels like a 100-degree day. And as we're projected to see more 90-degree days, 95-degree days, 100-degree days, Minnesotans need to be prepared for a temperature that feels much worse than that, and the ability for the body to respond to that. Again, looking at all those other factors that play into how we respond to heat events is important. So health professionals, public health professionals need to be aware that it's not just the air temperature, but it's also humidity and other factors such as shade, green space, and things like that, access to cooling centers. As I mentioned, with air pollution, the smaller the particle, it can actually transfer into the bloodstream where all body systems are have potential to be affected. These are some of the ways in which air pollutants impact the human body. So this is both an exacerbation or a cause of these different manifestations in the body. How we treat illness and disease also has an impact. So I like this story because it's a relatable example. There are 34 million Americans that live with a chronic lung disease. About 25 million of those have asthma. In 2020, metered dose inhalers made up 75% of inhaler use in the US. This is equivalent to driving 500,000 cars annually. And that's because the propellant used in metered dose inhalers is a hydrofluoroalkane, which has a larger global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So the way that you're treating asthma is with something that actually causes climate change and exacerbates asthma. So it's an interesting look at a positive feedback loop um, in the way that we try to help people actually exacerbating the problem, and how healthcare in itself is part of the problem, and we need to look inward as well as outward. Finally, in terms of this, we'll look at food and water safety and mental health. 70% of water pollution comes from nitrogen runoff. This is particularly concerning when we're looking at flooding events. There are about 3,000 bodies of water in Minnesota that are already on the impaired water list. We talked a little bit about harmful algal blooms, invasive species that change the marine ecosystems of our lakes, rivers. Agriculture is the largest consumer of water globally. So as we look at the projected changes between precipitation and drought patterns and that frequency and shift, there's concern for how we use our water and how we conserve our water. And then we also have seen in some studies that higher greenhouse gas emission concentrations actually decrease our staple crop nutrient makeup. So especially when we're looking at zinc, iron, and protein, we see a decrease in those nutrients, deficiency in those nutrients of our staple crops. And we talked a bit about mental health. There is an increase in climate anxiety and grief. One particular study that I like is of Hickman et al. 2021, where they looked at 10,000, they surveyed 10,000 global youth and found that 70 to 80% were worried or very worried about climate change and were experiencing some form of climate anxiety. Um, we also know that untreated trauma impacts the way that people perceive and prepare for complex concepts. One of those being climate change and extreme events. And so it also calls attention to the need for trauma-informed care and proper care following events, well, both prior and following extreme events. We know that climate change impacts all of us. It doesn't impact all of us equally. These images are from 2023. The upper left is the fires of Maui, Hawaii. The upper right is New York during the 2023 wildfire smoke event that also hit Minnesota or covered Minnesota. I believe the lower left is Hurricane Ian. And then the lower right is the heat event of Arizona, where individuals were falling on sidewalks and getting second-degree burns, as well as it being too hot for cacti. We also see that climate change doesn't just impact health, it also impacts livelihood and impacts economics. In 2024, we had 27 separate billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters, totaling $182.7 billion. Since NOAA has been recording these events in 1980, we have seen $2.9 trillion dollars worth of damages because of events like this. We can also see variations regionally. So this is a typical July day in Minnesota. Apologies that my cities have been shifted off to the left. I don't know why that is, but this is Brooklyn Park, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. In July 2016, it was a 90-degree day. And this map is depicting the land surface temperature. And I want you to think about what's going on here. I'm going to move relatively quickly to the next slide, but think about what's going on here. I kind of gave you the background. Why is this, and what are we seeing? What we're seeing is the heat island effect. So this is where the built environment actually absorbs solar radiation, making it feel hotter than it actually is, or what the air temperature, the ambient, the surrounding air temperature is. What we can see on average is 1 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer ambient temperature, and all the way up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the surrounding air temperatures. This is especially concerning at night where that solar radiation is released and in a time where humans get reprieve from the heat of the day. But with that solar radiation making that nighttime temperatures warmer, we actually don't get that reprieve, or we're stressed our utilities even more. So that's what we're seeing on the left. So in certain areas of Brooklyn Park, Minneapolis, St. Paul, it actually on that 90-degree day felt like it was 100 to 125 degrees in those areas compared to those places with more natural environments where it could have even felt like it was about 20 degrees cooler, 15, 20 degrees cooler. So that's kind of the differential that we see there. The map on the right, if we overlap this land surface temperature with the map on the right, we see that um, those same areas where it felt warmer are the same areas that have higher percentile people of color across the state. So again, Brooklyn Park, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And unfortunately, this is more or less by design because of systemic racism, systemic oppression, and redlining. These populations are closer to highways. Live in areas with less green space. They live closer to industry. They live in low income areas and area they're renters, things like that, where they don't have control over their environment. And so they experience these sorts of inequities. We also see air quality in Minnesota is changing in that we're experiencing more or seeing a trend of more air quality alerts and in the higher categories of danger, whether that's unhealthy, very unhealthy, or in 2025, we had our first hazardous air quality index alert. Again, those populations, low income people, indigenous and people of color, already live in areas where they are at a greater risk, or they live in areas of higher air pollution above the risk guidelines. So this is a cumulative effect to what they're already experiencing. We see that this isn't just an urban issue. In rural areas, we're concerned for lack of access to broadband and other technologies that impedes their full participation in the economy, in their education, and also having information to make informed decisions. And in our indigenous populations, there's uncertain access to resources in the environments in which they live and communicate with or commune with. As these ecosystems adapt to climate change, our indigenous populations can't necessarily adapt with them because of the boundaries of treaties and everything else. They don't have that luxury of moving with their environments that are not only a part of their livelihood, but they're their spiritual ancestors. This image here, this map is from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and it just shows their areas of concern for environmental justice across the state. And we're going to shift into some of what we have seen in terms of climate change and what we project to see in Minnesota. Um, We're already seeing a warming of our climate. Minnesota's average annual temperature has increased by 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. We see that winters are warming faster than any other season, and that northern Minnesota is warming faster than the southern part of the state. Not only is Minnesota getting warmer, it's also getting wetter. So the 10 wettest and warmest years on record in Minnesota all occurred after 1997. In the heaviest rainfall events of the year, we measure 13% more precipitation in those events. And our growing seasons have lengthened by about 2 weeks since 1950. So we're having longer shoulder seasons. Um, we're seeing a shift in the type of air, the source of air pollutants from our air quality alerts. So prior to 2012, most of our air quality alerts were related to the ozone. Since 2012, we're seeing a change of that being towards wildfire smoke and also an increase in those alerts. We're projected to see warming across the state. I chose this measure, so this is days per year warmer than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, because 90 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the source that you're looking at, is the beginning qualifier for an extreme heat event. So it has to be 90 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 days in a row. I also chose this because in northern Minnesota, where they may not have experienced any days above 90, we see a shift to maybe 15 to 20 degree days, 25 to 30, depending on where you're looking. And a lot of these populations and homes don't have adequate air conditioning because they live in lake country or they're in the colder climate, or that's historically where they've been and they haven't needed that. And so in my opinion, these are populations that we really need to get ahead of the game in terms of preparedness and adaptation to make sure that they have appropriate housing for the climate that they're projected to see in the relatively near future. We also see a change in seasonal precipitation by mid-century, and this is under the very high emissions scenario. What I wanted to highlight here is that although we see or expect to see an increase in average precipitation annually, this isn't uniform across our seasons. So spring and winter are going to increase in precipitation, whereas our summer is going to be notably drier, and autumn is kind of a mix depending on where you live within the state. I also want to look at winter because the winter precipitation is projected to increase, but it's also warming, and so that precipitation has a higher likelihood of being wet, heavy snow, or freezing rain in comparison to the fluffy white stuff that we love to go skiing in. And so that can have a lot of structural damages, infrastructure damages. It's also the precipitation that is more associated with with heart attacks in the winter. And so this is something to be considerate of when we're thinking about our public health and populations that we're trying to protect. And lastly, I just want to add that I have a scholarship in planetary health. but I work in climate change now. Climate change is only a small part of the whole picture. And planetary health really takes this to a larger view, saying that we cannot be healthy as humans if we do not have a healthy planet. And there are underlying drivers of what causes the planet to be unhealthy or healthy, depending on the perspective that you take it, the perspective that you take. Depending on our culture, values, behavior, consumption, population size, technologies, all of those impact the environment in different ways, and the environment is all interconnected with one another through various systems. Those have proximate causes, which go through then modifying factors that can either alleviate or exacerbate the impact of those proximate causes on human health. And if I were to change one thing about this, is I would make it cyclical because those health impacts drive a lot of the underlying drivers. Planetary health is a solutions-oriented transdisciplinary field and social movement that analyzes and addresses the impacts of destabilized natural systems on human health and all life on Earth. So, like I said, essentially, you can't have healthy people if you don't also have a healthy planet. We are interconnected within nature, within the environments that surround us. We are not exceptional to, above, separate from, nothing like that. We are a part of all of this. And the last example of all of that is that this is from the Stockholm Resilience Center. It's the 9 planetary boundaries. You'll see that climate change is just one of the boundaries. Um, and humans have surpassed now 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So essentially, what our planet can withstand, the critical thresholds of that. So ocean acidification was just added in 2025, so the ocean is too acidic, or it has passed its uh, environmental threshold. It's us. We're sure it's bad, but we can fix it. And my one call to action for all of you is to do something, to take a climate action, whatever that may be. You don't have to solve all the problems. It's going to take all of us. But do something because the something that you do will have a ripple effect, whether that's within your family, your community, your practice. It could be within your environment, the environment that surrounds you. That one thing that you do will have an impact. So make an effort to do something. Um, I am sharing some organizations that both relate to climate change or to planetary health in varying capacities, as well as some tools that may be helpful to you as you continue with your education and go into practice. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for viewing this, and I look forward to speaking with you.